Hello, class. We have already seen that Foucault's archaeology of knowledge was an attempt to show his own version of approaching, organizing, and analyzing history. It was an attempt to describe the history of discourse, a set of things said, in all its interrelations and transformations. And we have also seen that it throws to wind all the preconceptions about historical unity or continuity, describing instead the process of discourse in all their disruptions, thresholds, differences, and complex varieties. We have already seen that archaeology of knowledge is actually divided into 5 parts, and let me give you a brief description, a brief summary of the 5 parts. The part 1 is introduction. Foucault starts with a polemical statement on the contemporary crisis in the study of history, a considerable shift in historical method. History had to confront discontinuity, the uncertain stages of the historical document, gaps in the historical record, and gaps between histories of different events and developments. So let me quote from the introduction. So this is how we start the introduction. Quote, for many years now, historians have preferred to turn their attention to long periods as if, beneath the shifts and changes of political events, they are trying to reveal the stable, almost indestructible system of checks and balances, the irreversible processes, the constant readjustments, the underlying tendencies that gather force, and then suddenly reversed after centuries of continuity, the moments of accumulation and slow saturation, the great, silent, motionless basis that traditional history has covered with a thick layer of events. So instead of this linear succession, instead of the essentialist tendencies, history is actually going deeper. So the research in history and the study of history has actually given way. The linear successions have actually given way to discoveries in depth. For example, beneath the rapidly changing history of governments, wars, and famines, there emerge other apparently unmoving histories. The history of sea routes, the history of corn or of gold mining, the history of drought and of irrigation, the history of crop rotation, the history of the balance achieved by the human species between hunger and abundance, etc., etc. The narcissist histories that actually seek the surety of the constant presence of a transcendent human consciousness, the everlasting, never changing essence, has become outdated. It's almost impossible to form a single history of humanity, a civilization, a nation, in linear progression of key events alone. People have found out that multiple readings and layers are possible for everything that happened. Historians were confused about making decisions over what events even go together and which archives they draw upon. Foucault thinks that too much attention has already been showered on events, and now it's high time to pay attention to how people talk about the world at a particular time to find out the modus operandi of social structures at a given time. In the same way, to have a better understanding of the social changes, we should find out how people look at them. That is, we should treat the historical documents not as true, factual, and objective record of what has happened, but rather as texts that indicate the assumptions underlying a larger social order. The ways things are talked about in historical documents tells us more than the events they refer to. So, diversity and disruption has become the norm. A great paradigm shift happened not only in the field of history, but also in those disciplines that we call the history of ideas, the history of science, the history of philosophy, the history of thought, and the history of literature. In those disciplines, which despite their names evade very largely the work and methods of the historian, attention has been turned on the contrary away from vast unities like periods or centuries to the phenomena of rupture, of discontinuity. Beneath the great continuities of thought, beneath the solid, homogeneous manifestations of a single mind or of a collective mentality, beneath the stubborn development of a science striving to exist and to reach completion at the very outset, beneath the persistence of a particular genre, form, discipline, or theoretical activity, one is now trying to detect the incidence of interruption. Part 2 is titled Discursive Regularities, and it tells us about the ways to deal with fundamentally discontinuous historical records. He wants us to shun the pre given ways of chimeric unities that exist in the history of discourse. They are four in number. They are object of discourse, authors of discourse, concepts, and themes or theorems of discourse. As he exposes each aspect, it turns out to be more complex than we think. And these four aspects provide four levels at which discursive formations can be analyzed. That is, the formation of objects of discourse, the formation of uh, enunciative positions or modes, and formation of concepts, and the last one, the formation of theoretical strategies. These categories have to be proven and not assumed from the very beginning. We should go through the documents to extract the patterns and connections naturally emerging. We always have to ask when, where, and what under what conditions certain statements actually emerge. Foucault calls this a discursive formation and asks for unpacking the rules of formation under which a certain kind of statement has achieved regularity. We have to find out who gets to speak a statement, in what institutions and contexts are these statements intelligible, and how do these statements construct different concepts and relate them in a common field. By finding answers, we can trace how a discourse emerges as if of its own force. This is not a history of geniuses who invented new concepts, but a history of how particular concepts and ideas emerge within particular social and cultural contexts as many people begin to talk about the same thing in the same way. Part third is titled The Statement and the Archive, and it shows the analysis of the statement, the fundamental unit of discourse. We have to start from the smallest elements and move up to the most general totality while analyzing a discursive field. Although the smallest units are statements, they have no single stable unit. That is, they change size according to their field of use. A statement refers to a specific aspect of articulated language than it does to a unit of language. It is the level of the active historical existence of a set of signs. Then Foucault gradually moves up to the level of the archive, the general system of the formation and transformation of statements. A statement, according to Foucault, is defined by its function as it brings forth the rules for ordering different concepts. The rules, the unspoken constraints on what it is possible to speak at a given time, actually matters. It is more important than the individual who utters a statement because no individual owns the rules of a discourse. And how statements accumulate rather than where they come from are more important. Statements begin to refer to and build on one another. Then, by analyzing these statements, we can explain how a social order transforms in terms of the ways in which a world is understood and organized at a given time. Part 4, Archaeological Description, addresses the difference between Foucault's archaeological method and that of the history of ideas. Foucault calls what he is doing not just history but archaeology for the issues of originality, contradictions, comparison, and change. He claims that his method replaces broad continuities and generalizations with specific, describable relations that preserve the differences and irregularities of discourse. And his archaeological method focuses on history of science and how it is carried out. Foucault considers documents to be monuments that have to be excavated rather than mere records of other monumental things like the events of a war or the series of inventions and discoveries that led to the light bulb. Archaeology does not study discourse to understand something else, but attempts to understand the documents themselves, how they emerge within a field of unspoken rules regarding what to think and speak at a given time. Foucault is not looking for coherent singular narratives or for general truths. He is interested both in the gaps and in the continuities of discourse. He is not interested in individuals but in discourse with its own autonomy and rules of organization. Part 5 is conclusion. And in the conclusion, he answers hypothetical critics of his method. He defends archaeology against charges that it is essentially structuralist and that it invests discourse with transcendence over other elements of history. He vehemently says that his archaeology is not just another structuralism. In structuralism, the elements of a society or language can be described in relation to a master system. It diminishes the initiative of individual and grand historical changes. Foucault says that he eliminated neither individuals nor history. Instead, he proliferated the different subject positions that individuals can take in discourse, and he focuses on the conditions under which individuals actually speak. So rather than summarily rejecting historical change, he analyzes change in terms of how discourses develop and accumulate. He says that his is not a history of dates and events but a history of social change.